Okay, everybody. I'm streaming again, hopefully. And in a minute, we're going to start talking about kind of the basics, the first starting point for some enemy AI in our game. So, in a 2D a 2D game like this, kind of a top-down game, one of the main things that we need for enemy AI is somehow the enemy has to be able to kind of detect the player, kind of see the player, to kind of say, okay, should I chase the player? Should I fire at the player? Should I run away from the player? That sort of thing. So this is one approach that I've used that demonstrates a couple of key concepts, and you can take it as is if you want, use it as a jumping off point, see where you can go with it. So I don't have the player's not the excuse me the enemy isn't going to do a lot of running around here, but we're going to focus on the concepts in this one. So I'm going to hit play and kind of run through and show you what's going on. So now this NPC here kind of automatically spawned, and you can immediately see you see this blue line here and this green line here. Now you see them, those are actually in the scene window, right? Those are our debug lines. They're like a lot like debug statements, just like debug print statements, but they are debug lines so that we can kind of see what's going on. Here in our game, they don't actually exist. So I'll move the player around. You can see how the player is moving around in the game. Now, let me tell you what the line means. You'll see that the line's color changes. And if I come around this side, even, you'll see the line go to red, to green, and to black eventually. Okay, so the blue line, for starters, in our little NPC here. Let's I guess I can zoom in a little bit. The blue line is the line of sight for the NPC, right, for the non-player character. So we're assuming here that the character is facing in that direction and looking sort of straight ahead, okay? And the black line to begin with, or the line that changes color over here, is telling us about the relationship of the character to the player, right? So excuse me, no matter where the player is, you'll see it starts off, I click in that window, I can move pretty far away, and the black line is going to be there. And that just says, okay, that is the relationship between the two. Now the green, when it goes to green, I'm saying, okay, the character is within range, sort of within range of the of the NPC. And there are two things that determine the range, right? So let's see if I do this right. I'm in the scene, so I should be able to move this. I'm going to move the NPC around a little bit. And if I move this through here, and let's move the character. Okay. So we get the green line, but now you'll see, let's, might have to move it all the way around. Let's talk about the code to kind of demonstrate. All right, so there's a couple of things. You want to know that there is a clean line or a clear line between the player and the enemy, right? There's no objects in the way like these bushes. You want to know that the enemy is facing in the direction of the player, and you also want to know that the player is within range, right? If the player's far enough away, the enemy won't notice it. Right, so a couple of different things. I don't have any behavior for the player or for the enemy yet, but I do have the detection. And there's a bunch of different concepts that sort of come into play. So I'll talk about them. Hopefully you can kind of think about this, play it back at your own speed. I don't want to go really long. I like to try to keep some of these little tutorials a little bit on the shorter side. So here's in my update routine. This is the update routine inside of what I'm calling enemy AI. Okay, an enemy AI is a script that runs on the enemy, right? So in this case, it's actually part of the NPC. You'll see in the NPC, if I scroll, here's the enemy script, enemy AI script. Okay, so the enemy AI script is on the NPC, which is the NPC in this case, is a prefab which gets instantiated in the scene by the player or the manager or the hero, right? So we covered that before. All right, so inside of update, this happens every frame, so every 60, 144, 50, whatever, every so often, as quickly as possible. This runs, and for debugging purposes, I draw 2 lines to begin with. And the first line, one of them is I make a vector. I make a line, basically a line segment or a vector that points from the position of this NPC to the hero. Okay, hero.position. Now, how do I get hero.position? Well, in the hero script, I have a static public vector2 position. So why is it static? Why is it public? Okay. When something is static, you can refer to the script name. That only one of those exists for every instance of this script, right? One exists. So that means it's easy for me to just refer to that one. When it's static and public, okay, it makes it so I can refer to that one. Now, if there were multiple heroes here, they would all have to share that. But since there's only one hero, this works out fine. So I say static public vector2 position. And then in my routine here, in my update, I set position equals transform position. So I'm basically copying the transform of whatever object this is on, which is the hero. So the position of the hero gets copied into that static public position. So that then from anywhere in my game, if I want to find out instantaneously, similarly to saying input or camera.main mouse position, those sort of things, right? I can globally sort of statically refer to the position of the hero. It's enforcing we just have one hero in the game. So that's what's going on over here in enemy AI. We just say, okay, hero, the hero class, the position, that's that one static global that we have there, static public. So we do that. We find that relationship, that vector that is going from, or it points in the direction of the hero from the position of this object, right? So then we can go ahead and we can draw a line from this object to the hero's position, right? So that's one of the lines. And then the other line is this line of sight. This blue is the line of sight from the position of the enemy, the position of the NPC, and we're assuming in this case we're going to use transform.right. So the enemy looks, they face towards the right. That's why that blue went off to the right there. Now what we do in this case, since we're drawing an array, we also just go ahead and just for convenience sake we say, okay, normalized. So we set the length of that vector to 1, and we multiply it by 5 because I'm going to use 5 as sort of like the distance that the furthest that the NPC can kind of look or detect, right? So now we can say, all right, let's check that vector that's between those two things, the thing that basically is pointing from the position of the NPC to the hero. First thing I want to do is check the magnitude of that vector. So that's the distance between the two. So this is going to say if h_vector.magnitude is less than 5f, so if the distance between the two is less than 5, okay, let's start detecting. All right. So it says, now let's draw that line again, but let's draw the line as green. Okay, and the line will be drawn from the NPC to the hero's position. So we get that green line as soon as we're within 5 units, 5 meters, 5, of the player. Okay, that's the first part. Now, the second part here is fancy. This isn't something we've seen before. What I'm using is something called a line cast. Right? What line casting does is it basically say, okay, I'm going to have a line that's drawn starting at a certain point to a certain point, and I want you to give me all of the things that that line would collide with. Okay? So if I bump into anything, if I touch any colliders along the way, give me them. Tell me what they are. Okay? In this case, it's going to tell me the first one. I'm going to use hit, raycast 2D. Hit is going to give me some information about what got hit there. Now, position and position, those are easy enough to understand. But there's this third variable, the third argument here called layer mask. This one's a little bit tricky. Okay, what the layer mask is it says, okay, what particular layers am I interested in looking at? Am I going to look at all the layers? Am I going to look at one particular layer? Am I going to look just at enemies? Am I going to, what am I going to look at? Where, what enemies, what objects am I interested in? Now, to set the layer, hopefully you remember, as we create game objects, we can assign the layer here, like layer NPC layer. So you'll see NPCs are going to show up on the NPC layer. The hero happens to be on the default layer. So if I click on you'll see he's on the default layer. All right. Now, in the code, it's being a little bit fancy here. I'm just using a layer mask, and I don't want to recalculate that all the time. So I calculate it once up here in my start routine. So as this enemy comes online, it sets up this layer mask. And the layer mask, what I want to do is I want to say, okay, I'm interested in all layers except for the NPC layer. Right? In this case, I assume that the NPC doesn't want to see itself. That's a little bit weird because the one thing about it is if there are multiple NPCs, and if there's an NPC in between the player and another NPC, that this might get a little bit weird in that the NPC might eventually see, it'll ignore all the other NPCs and see the player through another NPC, which is probably okay. And we're going to assume, like, say, okay, enemies, they can talk to one another. So if one enemy sees them, then the other enemies should be able to see them, right? So their enemies are invisible to one another, but they can see the player. That's one design thing. We can get fancier, I guess, eventually. But let's take that into account. All right. So that's what layers do. So this is doing, it's saying, okay, I would start off with a bit field that had all the bits set, and I would exclusive OR, I want to set the one bit that is the NPC layer. So I get the layer number, the NPC layer number, and I shift 1 to the left in order to put that bit, that one bit field, put the 1 in the appropriate location and set it to false in here. Set it to basically 0. This one's a little bit tricky, a little bit weird, right? So we'll leave that. Assume, like this case, you can do some more research on that. Ask me questions about it later. To say, okay, layer mask. I want basically it's to say, and if you calculate it, if you figured out, okay, what is the real number there of the NPC layer, you could look in the physics settings and figure out what number that is, and you could just create a hard code for this if you wanted, but we're doing it programmatically. Anyway, all right, so now we basically say if we hit something that is on a line that starts at our current position, pointing in the direction, or basically the line is going to be in between the NPC and the player. Excuse me. If the first thing it hits, according to that, it looks at everything except for the layer mask. Except for the NPCs. If it hits something, let's check what it was. If it's the player, that's a good thing. If it's something else, that means there's something else in between the player. It hits something else, like a bush, a tree, a building, something like that. So it shouldn't see the hero if something else is in the way. So I can use this hit, which is a raycast hit 2D. So that's a special object that tells us about what was hit. So I could say if hit equals that, meaning now it's going to check, okay, is this not null? If it's not null, I know I have a hit. And then I'm going to say, okay, hit.collider.gameObject.name. So the hit will tell us what collider was hit, what game object belonged to that collider, or what collider did that game, or what game object did the collider belong to, and then check the name of that game object, which in our case we're interested in hero. So if the game object of the collider of the hit turns out to be hero, okay, Now potentially we want to be able to see the hero. So we know it's close enough. We know that there's nothing in between the two. But last but not least, we want to say, well, is the NPC facing in the direction of the hero? And for that, we're going to use a little bit of math. We don't have to do the actual calculation, but we'll talk about this in a lecture a little bit later. Vector dot products are interesting in that basically you can use they're a scalar, so you get a scalar back when you take the dot product of two vectors, and that scalar is going to tell you how basically how similar those vectors are, right? If they're one, if the result is one, they are they perfectly line up on top of one another. If they're 0, they wind up being perpendicular to one another. If they're -1, they're facing basically in opposite directions, right? So this is going to tell us the right the right vector, the right axis, which is where we said, okay, it looks in the right direction, compared to the vector that we said is formed by the NPC and the player. We say, okay, if I project those two together, how aligned are they, right? If they're 1, they are perfectly aligned. If they're 0, they're not at all aligned. If they're negative, they're not aligned. So I say, all right, if it's greater than a certain number, which in my case, by default, I think I haven't initialized it here, but inside of the player, inside the Unity editor, if we look, we will see a value of around 0.8, which is a reasonable kind of a field of view, right? How much of an angle. So the closer that gets to 1, the more narrow, the more tunnel vision it has. The wider that number is, the smaller that number is, the wider the field of view it is, right? So if it was 0, we'd see everything in front of it. If we're close to 1, we're going to see a narrower and narrower field of view. All right. So we say if that number is higher than a certain number, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to draw a red line saying, okay, we can now see the player. We're close enough, there's nothing in between, and we're facing the right direction. We get that red line. Let's see if that works. Hopefully after all that. All right, so there's the code, and let's go ahead. So it's generating a NPC for us. It's facing in this direction, so it can't see us there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. I'm going to move it around. You'll see it's saying green, which is okay, I'm close enough. Eventually, if I get more than 5 away, that changes. And now I'm going to push it in this direction. Okay, red. That means it can see us. You'll see as I go far enough to left and right, what's going to happen is my dot product is going to become less than 1 here and less than 1 here, so it sees us. So now red means that we can be seen. So let's try one more thing and say, all right, now I've got this bush here, and I'm going to go ahead and make this bush 0.5, a little skinnier, just to prove my point, and say, all right, let's grab the bush and push the bush down, and you'll see as soon as it crosses that line, as soon as the collider for that crosses that line, then the enemy goes back to green, saying, okay, you're close enough, but our line cast returned the bush before it returned the player. So we couldn't see it. So now our player can hide behind the bush. Now click over here, and you'll see it goes, let's see, far enough away, it can't see me at all. And if I'm way up here, even if I'm past the bush, it can't see me because it's kind of nearsighted. Okay, now I'm close enough, but it can't see me because the bush is in front. And now if we push the bush down, you'll see, okay, at some point, it's not perfect, it could be tuned more. At some point, I'll move this house a little bit here. Modifying my environment. So that if I'm up here, you'll see green, and then eventually if I can, well, I can't quite fit myself. Whoops, I hit F. What did I do? I changed what I'm seeing. Let's go back to main camera there. All right. There. And see. So once I'm in the view and close enough. So if here, eventually I walk far enough away, and we just assume that the enemy sort of becomes nearsighted. So there you have it. That's a simple detection algorithm that's actually pretty sophisticated. That it's you can decide, all right, once the player can be seen, then you have to decide what to do. Are you locking on? Are you moving? Are you following? Moving that direction, rotating, and so on and so on. And we'll talk about that in another tutorial. All right, everybody, shoot me any questions if you have them. I don't think anybody joined the chat, but that's cool. See you tomorrow or the next day. Take care.